Thank you so much, Richard. It's truly a pleasure to be back here at the East-West Center and to be able to be speaking with friends and colleagues and parts of the East-West Center community. My experience as a fellow in the Asia Pacific Leadership Program was truly transformative and really informed a lot of my thinking in this book. It introduced me to friends and colleagues who have been research interlocutors and people who have helped to inform my insights in this book and in my first book, Hollywood Made in China. So I'm really indebted to the East-West Center and the EWC alumni community for the really a lot of my career and a lot of the way in which I've been able to engage with Asia and with the Pacific throughout my work. So it's a true pleasure to be here, and I want to thank everyone for hosting me. So today I'll be discussing my book, Trafficking Data: How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. And a lot of you may actually be familiar with some of these debates. As we can see these over the past few weeks, we've actually seen the app TikTok banned in a wide range of different state governments, largely out of security concerns related to China. So you may be wondering why this is happening, what those potential risks are, why there is this action, and why it's happening at the state level. So what I talk about in my book is the ways in which the fragmented US data security landscape enables the Chinese government to expand data gathering through a very expansive vision of what constitutes sovereignty, specifically through this idea of cyber sovereignty. So what I argue in this book is that US regulatory fragmentation, Silicon Valley's data lust, and Wall Street's addiction to growth actually fuel the expansion of China's digital realm. So these TikTok bans that you may have heard of are not actually the result of, a particularly distinctive practice exclusively that's the result of China's actions, but also emerges from a very fragmented US data security environment, particularly one that provides advantage to corporations and their ability to extract user data. So when we're thinking about these TikTok data bans or these TikTok app bans in state governments, it's not just a response to China, but it's also a response to the very fragmented, extractive, non-transparent data gathering environment that we have within the US. And we can actually see how this is playing out even in a broader context like the Twitter acquisition, which is less connected to the Chinese government, less connected to a company that has its origins in China, like TikTok parent company ByteDance does, but is also one that's extracting huge amounts of user data in the US from US citizens and from people who are using that platform. And what we see in the kind of destruction of Twitter at the hands of Elon Musk is that there's so little oversight over data and security of, on our social media apps in the US, that this creates a heaving regulatory gap, that can exploit user and consumer data and user and consumer need. And this creates challenges domestically within the US, but then when it's combined in an international context, within the US-China relations context, it becomes even more complicated because the US and China have radically different visions for what constitutes digital sovereignty, what constitutes the digital realm, and who should own that space. And what's really interesting, and one of the things that I really loved about writing this book, and one of the reasons why I hope that some of you have the chance to read it, is that this idea of what even constitutes a digital nation or the digital sovereign space is something that's really up for debate, and where different countries have different interpretations of these ideas. So what this means is that we're really in a moment where the United States and China are, with their massive tech industries, trying to define these terms, and with very different political models, and also a lot of financial incentive to maximize user data gathering. Now, one of the reasons why I think this book is so important, why this subject matter is so important, is that one thing that does not exist either in the US or in China is a real incentive to advocate for consumers or to advocate for users. In China, what we see is a very expansive Chinese government data security environment where there are large scale government surveillance of users, which has only been enhanced during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, through things like health codes on the social platform WeChat. Now, one thing that we do actually see in the Chinese context is pretty robust data security for users against corporate extraction extraction. So in the Chinese context, we see an environment where there's really robust oversight for users to protect them from corporations, but very little oversight that protects users from government access to data. In the US context, what we see in contrast is an environment where there's a lot of incentive for corporations to gather and extract our user data quite expansively and exploitatively, and they're financially well rewarded for it. There is less government oversight over user data, and there are fewer mechanisms for government oversight over user data. But in neither case is there a very strong regulatory body or a very strong principles that protect users from both corporate and government data oversight. So really, and user data forms the core of a lot of new technologies and services. And actually, what I argue in the book is that it forms the foundation for global control in the political and economic landscape of the 21st century. And this can include the data gathered by corporations, data gathered by governments, et cetera. Now, what I want to do to foreground this discussion, and one of the things that I think that I'm really grateful for my East-West Center education for, is the importance of thinking about global issues also within a context of questions of discrimination and anti-racism. And the really, really important value that I got from my East-West Center education about understanding the perspectives that we have that exist in Washington, as well as those that exist in Beijing, and how without a kind of nuanced and very careful perspective on US-China policy issues, we can delve into really significant concerns of sort of concerns about a yellow peril or anti-Asian racism. So I think this is really important to discuss any of these questions, any questions of US-China tech relations, by acknowledging first that within the US, what we see is a very challenging environment where there is a sort of broad China threat discourse, where policymakers in Washington consider this idea of China as a leading competitor, as a potential political threat, and what this can create is an environment where it's difficult to do nuanced policy analysis that focuses on specific targeted issues, and instead paints all interactions with China in the same brush. And I think that so I want to foreground the fact that this is something that when I talk about issues of data security and when I talk about issues of the Chinese government and Chinese government data gathering, I'm talking specifically and narrowly about China's expansive vision of what constitutes the digital state, or cyber sovereignty in Chinese political language, and how this interacts specifically with the regulatory environment in the United States and the very fragmented, very limited digital oversight environment in the United States, and the interactions between these two things. One of the challenges that we see, and this is something that the scholar Pardis Madhavi brought up in her book called Gridlock, which was a discussion of women in Iran, is that and how that discussion of women in Iran was mobilized in the United States and had the chance in the US context to actually mobilize anti-Muslim racism and anti-Muslim violence, is that while it is important to talk about these challenging policy issues, if we talk about them without situating them within the environment that we see in a place like the United States, where there is a kind of history of anti-Chinese racism, then that discourse or that discussion can fit in with it, then can continue that that type of discourse. So I want to first foreground the fact that we do exist in an environment, particularly now in 2022, and following the pandemic, where there has been an epidemic of anti-Asian racism, particularly anti-Chinese racism. So when we're talking about these questions of data security and competition between China and the United States, it's important to be as narrow and targeted as possible to not feed further into that discourse. And I'm happy to talk more about this idea of the quote unquote China threat and how the China threat further complicates any discussions of US-China policymaking during the Q&A. Now, at the core of my book is this idea of data trafficking. Now, what I argue is that data trafficking is the movement of corporate data, the exploitation of corporate data with limited consent or acknowledgement to expand political control. So this is an idea that emerges from not just China's expansive vision of digital sovereignty, but also an environment where within the US, we see that it's possible for corporations to extract data from users with very limited oversight and very misleading or very complex terms of service. This becomes really interesting when we're in an environment where there's data protection for users age 13 and above. But if we look at some of the terms of service that kids sign in order to access apps, that any of us sign to access the apps that we use on our phones, most of it is not written at a 13-year grade level, 13-year-old level for age. And in fact, it's difficult for adults to understand. So when we think about these very exploitative and contracts that users might sign, we can see that this emerges not just from an expansive vision of digital sovereignty that emerges from China, but also from a very extractive environment in the US. But data trafficking emerges through a wide range of different practices. So through the compliance with local data gathering requirements that we see in data localization requirements in China, the outsourcing of data to third-party businesses or the use of data brokers. So even when a company that you have an agreement with, terms of service agreement with, sells your data as a third-party broker. So in most apps that we sign up for or that we use, the app reserves the right to share data with other users. Data leakage, so poor security. Security is not always what's paid for first. The most important thing is features that get things to market, as well as kind of unethical but not illegal advertising practices. Now, when we think of user data, there are a lot of metaphors that apply for this idea of user data. So we can think of it as a sort of new oil. This is a common metaphor that's used, this idea of something that we might extract. The challenge is that we're extracting it from human beings. We're extracting it from our lived experiences. So this idea of thinking of user data as the new oil fails to incorporate this idea of very personal or interpersonal information. At the same time, one of the reasons why corporations in both the United States and China try to extract as much user data as possible, including our biometrics, the contacts on our phones, how we use our phones, our IP addresses, et cetera, our voices, our videos, is that user data can be transformed into capital. It can be used as a form of equity that can be then leveraged for actual financial capital and assets. Now, when we think of the word trafficking, there are also multiple dimensions of this word trafficking. So there's this idea of drug trafficking, a system of trade that exists within a context of transnational border movement of an important and valuable commodity across borders. But the other thing that's important to note here is when we think about the drug trade, we think about users and this form of addictive behavior or addictive engagement with a product. And when we think about social media and we think about the ways in which our platforms and apps become more addictive, the more that we use them, the more they know us, the more they gather our user data, then this idea of traffic becomes more meaningful. When we think about human trafficking, we can think about the type of data that's being extracted from us, our very human data, our voices, videos of our behaviors, our contacts, our loves, our likes, our dislikes, and also our biometrics and how we interact with platforms. We can also think of this as a non-consensual labor agreement or a not fully consensual labor agreement, where users are often providing content or providing insights to a platform. So when you upload a picture onto your Instagram, when you upload a video onto your TikTok, you are also engaging in labor on that platform to help create content. And in many ways, the Elon Musk deal for Twitter really has laid that bare in this effort to expand, in order to expand Twitter's financial base. Elon Musk has asserted this idea of requiring people to pay for a blue check or a kind of verified user identity. But this verified user identity is generally something that was accrued by the most productive members of the platform, so people who created content for Twitter. And so this new discussion of requiring people to pay for a blue check really underscores how exploitative that labor system is, where people have been writing and creating content that brings people to the platform, but now the platform actually wants to charge them for that opportunity. We can also think about data traffic. So when we're thinking about users and when we're thinking about the movement of data, the more users that we have, the more traffic that exists on an app or on a platform. And the more traffic there is, the more robust that algorithm can be, because it's able to gather more information from users. This leads to something called network effects. So network effects are this idea that the more populous a network is, the greater its value. So when we have more people using a platform, it expands the user base. So we can think about a negative example of this where people talk about not going on Facebook anymore, how they never use Facebook, and Facebook is only for really old people who aren't up to date on their social media. So this is kind of the reverse of network effects, where fewer people use the platform and therefore fewer people go on it and onward and onward and onward. Whereas we see also in the context of a platform like TikTok or an app like TikTok, that the more users there are, the more advertisers think they need to be on it, the more other people want to join, and the more powerful that algorithm then becomes. So network effects attract more users. It leads to a better user experience and retention. The more friends, colleagues that you have on the app, the more you want to use it. It also enhances, it also develops better knowledge of contemporary needs and interests. It helps to ensure better algorithm, more optimized ads. It enhances data collection. So network effects become really important and also really drive user data engagement and drive profit margins. Now, what we see within the US tech ecosystem is that this growth and extractive data gathering has really outpaced government regulation and oversight. And instead, we see high levels of privatization of individual data and a really fragmented oversight environment. So what we see is this lack of regulations has led to something called surveillance capitalism, or a business model run on user data collection or the monetization of users, a very exploitative data gathering system that is also very lucrative for firms that want to produce ads. Now, what we see in this environment of surveillance capitalism is that it's very, very difficult to implement nationwide data protection regulations for users. And so that has created an environment where we see executive orders trying to protect user data, and where we see state governments acting independently to block the use of things like the TikTok app on the phones of state governments, of state government employees. Now, this creates a really weird dynamic where it's not that those state government employees can't use TikTok on their personal phones, and it's not that there are protections, for example, for their family members or for other people who might be using TikTok, and what we see is that there are also other types of user data protections that are very limited in scope. So for example, New York has financial data protection regulations. Chicago, the state of Illinois has specific biometric data regulations. California has consumer privacy regulations. But these differ across states, but apps and our technical use, our technical engagement with different types of platforms really is not something that's a state-by-state consideration. On a national level, there's also this kind of strange fragmentation where there are different laws for people under and over 13. There are different laws for health information, not just health information. So health information is protected, but only when you're going to see your doctor, not when that same information is gathered on your Apple Watch, for example. We also see a kind of really interesting dynamic where, in addition to those state laws and sector by sector laws, there are executive orders which protect user data, but that can be stripped with each administration. So over time, we also see a shift in the type of oversight that occurs in the US, as opposed to in China, where there are, kind of data regulation and oversight plans that are designed to last for 5, 10, 15, 30 years. So within a Chinese context, first of all, there's a very broad definition of quote unquote data and critical data that the government has oversight over. Within the US, there is less of a broad definition of critical data, critical infrastructure that the government can have oversight over, largely because of the power of the private sector in the US and the proprietary data benefits those firms are able to accrue as a result of holding that user data. And in a US context, 80 to 90% of user data and of critical infrastructure is held within the private sector, which is very different from a Chinese context where any critical information infrastructure is run and stored on Chinese government-run servers. So what we see is that there's a really, with each passing year, there are more and more expansive laws operating in China that are designed to oversee user data. So in 2017, the cybersecurity law required all critical information infrastructure to be stored on Chinese government-run servers. The 2019 provisions for online internet governance created civil and criminal penalties for any producers, consumers, or distributors of digital content that were identified as violating China's national security, broadly stated. The 2021 data security law allowed for and required national data security audits for any firms that were gathering data in China, as well as any Chinese firms operating globally, which is one of the laws that really makes people concerned about TikTok and its parent company, ByteDance. We also saw in 2020, the Hong Kong national security law created a mechanism for data oversight globally for anything related to concerns about Hong Kong's national security. And then recently in 2022, we've seen new laws for a kind of expansion and formalization of China's social credit system, which is a system of data oversight, not necessarily one system, but a variety of different systems that come together to manage and oversee user data. And then in 2023, we have an upcoming deep fake law, which will oversee user data in the creation of deep fakes or synthetic media. So in contrast to a US system where there are kind of very narrow, very targeted and regionally specific data security considerations, like, for example, just banning TikTok in individual states. In China, what we're seeing is this really expansive vision for what constitutes data oversight with things like national security data oversight, data audits, national requirements for data localization, the localization of user data, national requirements for overseeing digital content, national requirements for protecting and analyzing deep fakes, protecting users against deep fakes, national oversight for things like the social credit system. So these are two radically different systems that are currently abutting up against one another. And this has implications not just for the US or for China, but for countries around the world that are choosing between using Chinese tech platforms and US tech platforms. So China has created a really expansive claim to digital sovereignty that includes not just China's borders, but really anywhere that Chinese corporations touch, as well as any locations where there is a perceived damage to China's national security. So this is national security broadly defined and actually, very rarely clearly defined, if ever clearly defined in a lot of these laws. Now, what this also creates is an environment where there's a lot of regulatory asymmetry between China and the United States, where it's very difficult to operate a digital platform in China, particularly both for Chinese and foreign firms, but it's extremely, extremely difficult and almost impossible for foreign firms. By contrast, so really the kind of big partners in the Chinese context are companies like Apple and Tesla, which also are producing hardware in China. And so it's, whereas we see companies that are strictly gathering data through apps are having a very difficult time entering the market at all. By contrast, we see that in the US market, there are companies like Tencent that are able to operate quite broadly within a Chinese context or within a US context with the platform, with gaming platforms, really heavy investment in Epic Games and Riot Games in the United States, as well as in WeChat, the communication app that is really at the core of US-China communications. The other thing that's really interesting about Tencent is, in addition to its involvement in the entertainment sector, it's also part of China's military AI efforts. So they're also involved in developing dual-use technology. But the big tech sector has a really big conflict of interest within the China tech sector, and in some ways, this is how this first book, or the second book, is in many ways a sequel to my first book, where I talk about the challenges that the entertainment industry more broadly has in navigating the Chinese market, the types of trade-offs that they're willing to make in order to grow their market share. And we're seeing a very similar phenomenon in the tech sector, where there's where companies are willing to make a lot of trade-offs in order to enter the Chinese market. Fewer now than they were 5 years ago, but still really substantial decision-making to expand their potential profits. This then benefits shareholders, which then also further grows that market share. And what this ultimately leads to is an environment where the US-China tech relationship destabilizes global user data. It creates an environment where countries are choosing between the US and China, and face really significant challenges as it relates to how they will navigate between having a close relationship with China and a close relationship with the US, how they choose which technologies they use, because very few countries use only US technologies or only Chinese technologies. And an app like WeChat is essential for any countries that are trying to maintain trade with China, any companies that are trying to maintain trade with China, whereas a lot of US tech companies are essential for a wide range of different types of technical engagement. And what we're seeing is in places like Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, these are countries where there isn't necessarily consistently robust data security oversight or the resources for that type of data security oversight. But both the United States and China have exploited user data in those countries. So for example, Vietnam is a great example of a place where there are concerns about both China and the United States and potential data extraction. But it's not just countries in Southeast Asia or in Africa or Latin America. Over the past summer, I was doing research in Japan, and it was also a similar story where there are significant concerns about data extraction by US tech platforms, and also by Chinese tech platforms. And the calculus that Japanese policymakers have to take into consideration is, geographic proximity to China, as well as the as well as the significant volume of U.S. of trade between Japan and China, as well as military alliances in the United States, pressure from U.S. policymakers to engage less with China, despite Japan's unique geographic position vis-a-vis China and the importance of Chinese capital investment there. So none of these are really easy decisions for countries to make, and it also isn't helped by the fact that neither the United States nor China has a particularly great reputation around the world as it relates to user data extraction in a corporate setting. And so when I talk about data trafficking, it really comes down to the fact that both the United States and China, these two major technical ecosystems, have demonstrated a willingness to extract data from users, but for different purposes in some ways. So in a US context, we see this willingness to extract vast amounts of user data from as a way to enrich corporations, and without a kind of really without a significant consideration about the potential for social destabilization, as we see in things like Twitter and in Facebook. Within a Chinese context, there's also a huge amount of pressure from the government for corporations to share their user data, as well as for tech platforms to serve as a foundation for digital governance, both formally and informally. So formally, through things like health codes that undergird WeChat, or that are that are used on WeChat and undergird China's COVID-19 pandemic response, as well as things like Tesla's investment in China, and its ability to, and that investment's influence on the Chinese mobility market. So there, and to top all of that off, it's also very difficult to maintain robust data governance oversight because of the rapidly changing technologies that we see, and because of the financial incentives that corporations both in the United States and China have to continue extracting user data. So we do see in places like the European Union and Japan, where there's a sort of effort to have a more transparent flow of user data, one which is grounded in terms of service that are more readily understandable by users, as well as more user rights to data. But one of the challenges that we see here is that we also don't see really rapid growth in the tech sector, and kind of ubiquitous platforms that emerge from Europe or Japan. And so while we can see a sort of alternative model, it's also difficult to envision what that model looks like in the context of growth. So I'd like to thank all of you for listening to the basic foundations of the book. Now the book goes into a great deal of depth about specific case studies, ranging from social media to gaming to health to consumer products. So I talk a lot about things like the IoT devices in your house, so your digital, or so the platforms that are the foundations for your washing machines and your refrigerators and your baby monitors, as well as different gaming platforms that you might be using, as well as things like your different types of social media platforms that you might be using. And I'd be happy to talk about those cases more specifically, or some of the more recent developments as they relate to TikTok. For those of you who are interested in getting a little bit more, some op-eds, podcasts, or excerpts of the book, you can check it out at millercenter.org/trafficking data. And that has a little bit more about the book, as well as where to buy it. So thank you so much to everyone, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Anne. That was I guess bracing, or not frightening isn't quite the word, but I don't think many of us really focus that much on just exactly how much of our lives have been shared by unwittingly. And I love the juxtaposition of the U.S. Corporate model versus the Chinese more status model. One question I have is that there was some talk that when Xi Jinping began his crackdown against some of the larger Chinese tech companies, Jack Ma and so forth, that part of it was their fear that these corporations were holding more data and knew more about the Chinese public than the Chinese Communist Party did, and that was simply not acceptable. So you're on mute, I think.
Yeah, no. So this is so I think this underscores, so this is one of the reasons why it was just so fascinating to research and work on this book, and why even though I wrote it and I realize I'm being promoting it here, I really do think it's really interesting stuff to learn about, because you can see how the different models actually lead to different types of outcomes for users. And you're absolutely right that user data protection in China emerged from the party's fear that corporations would be gathering too much power. So, but that also led to better user data protection for consumers. And so it's not, the party's argument was that they're just protecting users, and actually there's this mobilization of the idea of data privacy in order to that the party had previously not been heavily involved with. And actually, for anyone who's spent time in China, most people have individual files about them, both digital, initially analog, and now digital. So it's not that user data privacy or keeping the data of individuals private was a huge priority of the party prior to this, but it is an idea that could be mobilized as a way to disempower tech companies. And in the US context, actually, there's historically, and I think we are maybe seeing a shift in this right now, or maybe have over the past 2 or 3 years, but historically, the growth of the US tech sector has been a major engine of US national power through the enrichment of the tech sector, through funding congressional campaigns, through rapid growth on Wall Street, and the enrichment of the finance sector in the US. So there hasn't been that same incentive to pull back or to mobilize these concepts. And so one of the things that was really important for me when I was writing the book was to provide a kind of voice for users both in the United States and China to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their models. Because in neither of these cases do we see an environment where the protection of users is really the protection and privacy of users is really at the core of the model. So yeah.
One question that's come in is about European rules, and you alluded to that towards the end, but it seems that to a certain degree, the EU's new restrictions are forcing themselves on these other, on the Chinese and the US models as well, aren't they? Is there some kind of third way that's coming up because of that?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really interesting question. And so as someone who isn't, so I do some work in the European Union, and for a long time, I was actually a huge advocate of these European laws, and kind of arguing that this is the third way and this is what we should follow. And then I started doing more field work in Europe, and then this past summer in Japan, which also has much more robust data privacy regulations. And frankly, my colleagues there were very depressed that while they had those data privacy regulations, that was inhibiting growth. And so as a result, they were kind of constantly in this moment where they were trying to regulate corporations from other countries, which presents its own challenges. So while there might be better data privacy regulations, you still have to be able to keep up with other countries, and that might not have your interests at heart.
But don't US companies, because of these regulations, have to sort of change their modes of operation? I mean, you can't have one set of algorithms for US. It's just too confusing because you don't really know where people are based, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, we have seen, for example, Google, the European Union sued Google, and they had to pay fines, and TikTok has changed their terms of service in Europe, and the European Economic Union, vis-a-vis what they offer in other countries. But there are a couple of issues with that. First of all, you have to enforce that, right? So it requires knowing that those violations are happening, which sometimes happens, but doesn't always happen. Second of all, it requires a certain amount of trust that even if TikTok, for example, has changed its terms of service for the European Economic Union, that it actually follows those. And it's so, for example, the Chinese government has a much more powerful position to influence the behavior of TikTok than the European Union does. So it's just not a perfect model. I think it does offer a pathway forward. But I think one thing that I want to be sure to represent is the frustration that policymakers in the European Union and in Japan feel about the limitations of their respective models. Because I was more like, yeah, we just need to follow these other countries that have it together. And then I talked to them and I was like, trust me, like I'm advocating, we just need to follow you. And they're like, well, I mean, maybe not. Maybe we have problems with our model as well.
Not this week, yeah. Question here about the amount of data that's being collected. Is it really sufficient to give the sort of AI capabilities that everybody is so afraid of over time? And by the way, I don't like the use of the term AI, and I prefer machine learning myself, because 99% of what we call AI is machine learning, but same thing based on big data.
No, that's an important, I think. So a couple of points, and this is one of the key differences between the US model and the Chinese model. So within a US context, there are we are gathering more and more data about users, but within a corporate context, there isn't as much incentive to be extremely granular with that data. There also is a financial cost to storing user data over a long period of time. So when there isn't like a kind of direct financial use, it doesn't make as much sense from a corporate standpoint to keep user data for a very long time. That being said, in a Chinese government context, when things are stored on government-run servers, there is an incentive to keep especially certain types of data for longer periods of time. And the case that I note in the book, which I found to be, and it's at the end of the book to kind of emphasize the fact that it's one of the bigger challenges, is the context of health data. So biodata, DNA, and things like that. There is actually a very clear incentive for a government to store biodata for long periods of time, because it provides really compelling medical and dual use military value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A question that was specifically about what role the East-West Center can play in educating congressional staff, but just generally speaking, how receptive have you found people in Congress and in the federal government? I mean, the FCC is supposedly looking, and we have a new regime that seems more in the United States more interested in this. So how receptive are our public servants, and also how much demand is there from the public itself, which might drive more policy changes?
Yeah, I think those are great questions, and it's also really important to ask them together. So I think that there's a lot of awareness on the part of congressional staff from both parties, in the executive branch and the legislative branch, about these issues. That being said, there are a lot of policy priorities that come before data security for a lot of people. And so when they're trying to serve their constituencies, a lot of it requires first defining what the problem is and saying, like, these are the potential risks that you face, and then contending with them. And one of the analogy that I use is the context of climate change, where it's a complicated scientific problem where a lot of the risks are long-term and not completely well-defined. So we can know that there are potential data security risks from data extraction, but we don't know precisely what they are because a lot of the technologies haven't emerged yet. And it's also something that, frankly, is very inconvenient, and users don't really want these changes. Like, it's it's fun when TikTok knows you really well because you get really good videos. And like having Amazon be able to recommend that very product that you always dreamed of is useful when you're trying to go Christmas shopping. So it's, so in that sense, it's also similar to climate change where it's like, okay, here's this problem. We're going to like give you the solution, but it's really a solution that you probably don't want, wouldn't really enjoy, and you can kind of ignore it,
Right.
at least for now.
I used to teach a course at Stony Brook on news literacy, and one of the things we would do is have our students do incognito searches just to see the difference in the kind of results they got, and they hated it because you're doing a regular it knows what you're going to type before you know what you're going to type half the time, and yeah, so that's this yes, a lot of this has been developed because of our allowing corporations to set the rules, but a lot of it is, well, I love that thing. Why do you call it trafficking? That's why you call it trafficking. People want it, and it makes it has a self-reinforcing effect, right? I mean, it's how do you get beyond that?
I did not answer that in the book, unfortunately.
So, well, but it does raise the issue of how do we get beyond these two this global divide that you've described, or do we not? Does the world just keep going down this road in which more and more you're going to have to make a determination of are you going to be in the China digital world or the US or Western
one? I think that we may be entering a world where, especially countries that have trade with both countries will be facing this challenge of choosing between who they actually engage with and who they don't. And it's a very difficult environment.
Yeah. Let's see. Let me go back and find this question here. Sorry. Okay, from Manuel Montes. How much of the U.S. government's lack of interest in protecting user data beyond its commercial value to private companies is due to its defense protection of original protocols of TCP/IP, such as no need to know source of message before passing on to the next node?
Yeah, so a lot of these frameworks are things that were developed by the U.S. government and with strong through the origins of the internet, through things like through DARPA and IARPA. And so there are incentives on the part of the US to maintain existing systems. And for example, one of the things I talk about extensively in the book is this idea of the multi-stakeholder versus multilateral environment, where we can really see that the US has benefited from corporations taking an active role in regulation. And this is something that the US pioneered and now is suffering from because a lot of tech corporations have global interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How dangerous, shall we say, is TikTok's access to collection of amalgamation and analysis of data from, say, the United States? I mean, there are, as you said, states are trying to outlaw it, if that's even possible. But what is the bottom line, or is there a bottom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends heavily on the type of data that's being gathered. And so I think in the context, for example, of the TikTok state bans, that's a kind of immediate consideration and immediate concern, because we're talking about being able to track state government employees.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a real concern just from a political management standpoint, mm-hmm. and especially and from a risk management standpoint. So when we're talking about it, and when we're thinking about things like like being able to track state governments, track state government employees, state governments that don't necessarily have the same kinds of cyber capabilities or cybersecurity protection capabilities that that the national government would have from a military standpoint. That's a really key risk management area because it can really destabilize like state infrastructure. So I understand why states would be concerned about that. Being able to do more targeted phishing campaigns using the contacts of state government employees, for example, is one example. Now, the other question becomes when we're thinking about like aggregate user data. So state government employees are one very specific, much more concerning group that have access to contacts, databases, a wide range of different technical resources than your average person would have. And oftentimes government resources that are not as well protected as they probably should be because of chronic underinvestment in cyber infrastructure at the state level. Now, when we think about kind of aggregate user data and general population data, the one thing that I really think about is kind of health data and things like, for example, a lack of protection of companies like 23andMe or blood test companies. One of the cases that I talk about in the book is how the state pension plan in California used to send their blood tests to a lab in China for cost efficiency purposes. That lab had a close relationship with the National Genomic Bank of China.
Right.
So things like that are like population level concerns.
Right. Actually, somebody asked about the use of genetic data for cold case, things, and that's an opt-in, opt-out sort of thing. I mean, a lot of this, does strike me as personal responsibility, if you will, and your own digital hygiene. Is there, a path forward of, the government just trying to get people to take better care of themselves online?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So actually people have been asking me what my next project is. And one thing that I'm thinking about doing is making this book into a manga that would be accessible to tweens, for example, who are rampant users of data and have, a wide range of different contact platforms and apps that they use, but who may not necessarily think through those questions. And to be perfectly frank, not just tweens or like young teens, but also, anybody who's kind of like, I don't necessarily want to read a 300-page book about data security, but I would like a couple of tips. So
right, yeah, no, use news you can use. Actually, somebody had asked before. Maybe I'll close with it. Have you seen any state, any national government come up with a good a model for digital sovereignty? Is Estonia, particularly? So yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that there aren't any models where I'm like, they've clearly got it figured out. Because most of the countries that have really great models, like, so for example, Estonia is, there's great digital hygiene there. There's a highly educated technical workforce. It's also a pretty small country. And so as a result, and, there's a lot of awareness of the potential for cybersecurity, of cyber hacks as a result of its proximity to Russia. So using Estonia as a model that the US should follow or that Australia should follow seems kind of unfair in terms of the different population level awareness and skill sets. I think that a lot of countries can learn from one another. So, we could take things from different models. So, for example, Japan has introduced this idea of data free flow with trust. So trying to find trusted partners for the sharing data. I think, it's possible to learn from GDPR. I think it's also possible to learn from China. Frankly, the Chinese government has really thought through a lot of these issues. So, for example, the deep fake law that's coming in 2023 offers protection for users and from the production of deep fakes in a way that we haven't seen in other places. And then within the US context, I think we can see an environment where there's been this kind of fostering of of growth, and that creates a certain type of national and international power. India has a really robust model of digital citizenship that has been focused on trying to bring people out of poverty, providing healthcare. It obviously has, some challenges in terms of implementation, but it's something, they're trying something different. And one of the reasons why I think this area is really exciting to learn about is that we are seeing countries try to grapple with this problem in a lot of different ways. And we don't have there's not a global consensus about the best way forward. So it's a really interesting time to be looking at and researching this area.
Yeah, fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. And to everybody who joined us, we hope you enjoyed this presentation.